Matt told me to talk about things, but also it's a little bit of a, going back and looking at these old pictures. So one of the more important things I brought today was the original Portland plan. We were hired in 1992, was it, Matt? What year do you think it was?
91, 92, yeah.
And they were they were expanding their transit system. And they were also inscribing an urban growth boundary. It was sort of the beginning of this idea of let's plan regionally rather than let's just control every growth spurt. Basically what planning departments had a tendency to do at the time was just sort of stomp out fires. Oh, growth spurt. Okay, well, let's control. Well, this was sort of the beginning of let's inscribe an urban growth boundary. Let's look at the infill sites around the transit systems. Let's look at infrastructure associated with transit rather than the highway. And it spurred these planning principles. And actually, the nice thing about Matt inviting me is Matt did a lot of these diagrams. We worked together, and so a lot of these drawings are actually his here. The next way we reinvented ourselves over the time frame was actually we did a lot of work for the Hope 6 projects. You guys are probably familiar with that. And the Clinton administration hired us to think about this sort of vision reality is what they called it at the time. So we created these principles and these measuring sticks for the overall projects that we did. And we boiled it down to these four, I would say. And we sort of rehashed them over and over and added 5, 6, 7, but then we kept on coming back to kind of these four as our principles. The first is this idea of connectivity. And it's really this micro-macro look at the world, that the neighborhood fits into the district fits into the region, and vice versa. There has to be a synergy between the two scales that you're working in. The needs of the region could be different from the needs of the neighborhood. At the same time, they need to support each other in both ways. Diversity and balance. It seemed crazy at the time. Oh my gosh, civic and commercial and residential all in the same place. Gee whiz, we're used to getting in our car and driving and getting milk. And so this was sort of not even a new organization, sort of a reorganization of what growth was like, this idea that you mix the pieces back together. Human scale at the time, once again, it was about sort of always the auto. Everybody would say, well, first you design the parking and then you design the neighborhood around the parking. Well, this was kind of the opposite. Let's design it around the person, the bike, and worry about the car on a second. Not take away the car, but certainly don't have it as the central component of the plan. And this one was somewhat radical too, this idea of conservation and restoration, and this sort of slowly turned into sustainability in some ways. This idea that there are going to be places in the city that are going to have new uses, and it's sort of a rebirth of a lot of these places and regeneration. So I'll show you a lot of examples associated with these principles. The first one is this idea of region and district. It's actually, that is Portland in the diagram. It's a small-scale version of Portland. And I have one of the original maps of Portland here. And then we kept on dissecting and zooming down and down into the sites. Our regional work we did a lot of regional work over the years. Portland was an early one. San Diego, Austin, Texas, Louisiana after Katrina was one of our big projects. Denver, Salt Lake, right before the Salt Lake City Olympics, and Denver. We would do a lot right when they were inscribing the new light rail lines. We'd look at the transit around that and try and look at growth associated with those. And I brought some of the early graphics. This is the transit-oriented development design guidelines, the beginning of sort of the term. And one of the earlier ones, it's 1990 was this. And it's all paste up, believe it or not. We were still not even computerized as far as what the graphics were. It's now 26 years old, this document. And so I brought that. The other thing that I did bring was this this idea of these circles, this idea that you actually lay out the transit system first, and that's the bones of your city, and each circle within it is actually a transit-oriented development. And a lot of this is still going on. My dad lived in San Diego, right here, and they're just starting to do one of the TODs on the Marina Boulevard. They're putting in the coaster, and so it's still happening. So it has a 26-year lifespan, a lot of these. Portland was an early one, this idea that, of the 2040. We're 24 years away from its full implementation, but...
So try to keep a mental image of that, and then after Joe's presentation, get up and take a look at the old school way of getting at the same diagram, which was to use USGS maps and Letrostat and Letrotape and stuff like that.
And this was important just because it did inscribe this urban growth boundary. That was a pretty radical idea. The other thing was they were trying to build a highway here, and we actually said, well, before we do that, let's look at the capacity of the rail. Let's look at the capacity of the sites around the rail lines first. And they actually never built the highway. They built the transit system instead. And Portland today is still considered, a beautiful city, and at the time it could have really been a different pattern. Chicago was something we looked at, and Chicago had this beautiful radiating pattern from Mumford, was it? Fly through these. Louisiana recovery was right after Katrina. This is probably the biggest hydrology project in the world. The idea that the Mississippi River dumps into two cities, Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and this was looking at how do you regenerate the place after a disaster like a Katrina. So the second principle about remixing the uses, that a neighborhood is made up of all of its uses, was our second one. And I'm using Stapleton to describe this, and I'm using one of the original plans of Stapleton. This came out of the Green Book, actually. Is what it's called.
So it's the old Stapleton Airport in Denver.
Yeah, sorry.
Right.
That's the existing conditions of the Stapleton Airport. The city started growing up around it. This is the city grid. It's considered one of the biggest infill sites in the world because of its scale. At the same time, it is an infill site because the city started growing around it. The planes were not able to land anymore, navigate through it during heavy snowstorms. They moved it 26 miles out to the east of the site, and then all of a sudden, Stapleton was a redevelopment site. The green plan was actually done by the city as part of their strategy, and then Forest City was chosen as the developer for the overall Stapleton project. And the story goes that Greg Vilken, who was the head of Forest City at the time, went and met Andres Puani and said, "Life's too short. I don't want to work with people I don't want to work with." Came to Peter, and we've been doing it, and we still we're on the final southern area of Stapleton here. It's been about a 17-year project for us. It's kind of the original idea of how you implement. Let me see if I can explain it. There's two real distinct parts of Stapleton. One is how do you reintegrate it back into the grid of the city. The other is what do you do with a new green field, and kind of how do you reinvent yourself, and what's the transition between those two sites. But Stapleton now is pretty mature, actually. Some of it's 15 years old, the downtown. It has a mix of uses, some of the earlier stuff where it was all ground floor retail on the bottom. This was considered high density at the time. We wish it was sort of up density at this point in downtown Stapleton. They wish they could have had more in this area. It mixed a lot of, not only did it mix uses, but it mixed a broad section of housing types and housing economies. They were selling big single-family houses right next to affordable housing in Stapleton, as it worked out. It transitioned from single-family to sort of a townhouse product, all the way up to the to the multifamily that you see in the town center. And then they had their Trump route. No, sorry. There was large open spaces in Stapleton that were, really impacted the place. Even in the existing grid pattern, there wasn't a lot of real community open spaces, and Stapleton was able to provide that. So the mix of uses, the broad cross-section of product type and economics, and also open space and sort of this next layer of uses. These unprogrammed open spaces and also programmed open spaces like the amphitheaters. The next one was this idea of human scale, not always doing stuff for the car. And one of the early diagrams, again, this is probably Matt's drawing again, was this idea of the quarter-mile radius. Oh my gosh, quarter-mile radius, what does it mean? Well, what it meant was that was the walking distance that we felt people would get to transit. And what it also meant is what we envisioned was this large open space around all of these things, which wasn't really ever the case. I mean, look at our drawing. Wouldn't it be great if it was absolutely open space around these half-mile, quarter-mile radiuses? But, always a core, always these series of formal parks, this quarter-mile around the transit as a sort of a measuring stick for how far somebody would walk, or what's the watershed, what's the pedestrian watershed associated with these places. One of the other early things, and what I thought I'd bring, when Matt said, bring these early icons of drawings and plans that were done back then, was this idea that we needed to visualize these things. We didn't have any reference to what a TOD was, right? Most of the towns at the time were sort of growing up like this, right? These sort of strips and setback parking in some way. And what we started to do along with Steve, who was the guy who did a lot of these mapping?
Steve Price.
Steve Price.
Yeah.
Steve Price started to visually transform these places. He used the computer to lay in this library of uses that we have. So the first one was this idea that, yes, light rail could come and work down these things. The second one was about landscaping, or giving it some scale through plants and landscape. The third one was about the architecture and how it confronted the street rather than the setback of parking. So this was the tool we used at the time to show people that there actually could be, how do I visualize these places? It's not just an imaginary thing. We can go back now and take pictures of places like this now that actually did it. At the time, there wasn't any real reference point for this. Sustainability, conservation, and restoration, the reuse of land, the regeneration. Is it a change of use, or is it the same use with more intensity? Creeks were buried. Let's dig up creeks and have them as features again. So to show you this principle, I have a plan that doesn't work. An image that sort of somehow got strange on me. Bay Area was at the time looking at regeneration of growth and where to infill in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different ones in the Bay Area that we worked on. And Alok probably worked on most of these together with me, right? Old Elm Village was in Petaluma. It's an infill site along the Smart Line. This is the Smart Line right here. It was this very odd piece of land behind a highway and some industrial. And we managed to put how many houses? All affordable housing. We were hired by Burbank Housing, which is 100% affordable housing entity out of Petaluma. And we did it around the park again. We mixed the product types with inside it. We got some pretty good density, even with some, what I would consider some low density housing product types. So they're all duplexes, actually, each one of these, and 100% affordability. And Alok was the project manager.
Before my time, but I remember visiting it had the multiple curves. We actually had a fire engine come around and make sure.
Yeah, the biggest issue actually was the street here. And they got very mad at me in the end. We had parking on both sides, parallel parking on both sides. In the end, they didn't implement the parking on both sides because the truck couldn't get through it. Or actually, it was because the big cars couldn't park. So we actually had to redesign this entire backside for the capacity that we had on the ring road around the park. Next one in the Bay Area is this transformation of BART stations, actually. This is the Richmond Transit Village. All surface parking at the time when we got a hold of it. The two magical things, I think, were happening at Richmond at this place at the time. The first one was they were able to afford a parking structure to consolidate this parking. That eased up all the land for development around the site. The second thing is they built a station that consolidated one of the only true 3 transit systems connections. It's Amtrak, BART, and the Golden Gate Transit. All were consolidated at this spot. So there was a bus piece. The Amtrak was this side here, that track, and this is the BART station. They consolidated all 3 of those systems at this point, and it's the only one in the Bay Area, I believe, that does that. We came in and we actually filled up the underground. It was an underground passageway. It's the old 70s, go underneath the tracks and then come back through. It actually got infilled in and became a at-grade surface here. These are the 3 systems now. This is BART, this is the Amtrak, and this is sort of the bus consolidated piece. All the parking that was on the surface was built in a structured parking. So that freed up all the land. And it's mature now, a mature place. So this was where the Berry Plaza was that you used to walk underneath with these sloping lands, and now it's lined with townhouses and the other uses. When Clinton was president and Cisneros was the head of the was head of HUD, he developed a program called Hope 6. So we worked for about 5 years doing Hope 6s over that time frame. And Hope 6, I don't know who's familiar with that, do you guys? It was a program that was trying to mix uses, intensify sort of the decaying urban housing. This was actually, the reason this site became available was because of the earthquake. This is where the highway collapsed. It went down the highway, and this was now called Mandela Village.
Before Hope 6, Housing and Urban Development really was solely interested in low-income housing. And its main focus was housing projects. And of course, there's a long history of housing projects that have been to the detriment, really, of the community rather than an asset of the community. So Hope 6 basically took a fresh look, said we can deliver more affordable housing, but we should also include market rate housing and a mix of uses so that the federal money that's spent is leveraging more walkable, more livable neighborhoods as opposed to just worrying about a building with housing in it.
Yeah, and the idea was to actually increase the density. If there was 30 houses on it, the idea was to get 90 on it, to get 30 affordable, get 30 mid-range, and get 30 market rate houses. It wasn't to decrease the density. It was a pretty incredible program at the time, and we worked for Oakland's Housing Authority to look at about 3 of their different projects. One was Mandela Village, one is Chestnut Court, and there was a third one out there. But I think that the biggest thing that happened here was the collapse of the earth. This is exactly where the 2 highways collapsed. And it turned off of the 880, which is right about here. I'm standing on the BART platform right now in this picture, actually the West Oakland BART platform. And the highway came around and went up the boulevard as it was. So it was the beginning of the Mandela Village. The architect was, who did it alone? Do you remember? Pytok? I think it might have been Pytok. Or no, there was a gentleman out of San Francisco. What was his name? I didn't do any of the architecture in any of these slides. I'm just the urban designer on this. Most of it is just done through guidelines that we created. So I think that the big move on Mandela Village Gateway was sort of this urban front against the BART station and the mix of uses on this street. But as it kind of transitioned from the urban, the backside is actually it deals with what's across the street. It's the smaller scale Victorian single family. So you wouldn't even know that this was the same project as that original slide. So this transition, this idea of transitioning from sort of this large scale urban pattern next to the transit to the smaller scale neighborhood scale was really one of our biggest design moves for Mandela. Bay Meadows practice track, 1993, I think it was. Right now they're working on the actual track. They closed down the practice track at this time before they closed down the real track. Caltrains is on this corridor here. Caltrain.
So this is on the peninsula in San Mateo.
This is in San Mateo, correct, sorry. Highway 1, where is it? Well, I'll get you oriented on the next slide.
Very good.
So once again, one of my old drawings, hand-drawn, hand-colored, trees placed with a template, drawing every circle and colored in. This is the 101 here. This was the main track that they haven't closed down until just recently. Franklin Funds was a large occupant. They took up the whole office. There was retail on this edge. Whole Foods occupies this. And then the residential is here. So this isn't a real vertical mix of uses. This is kind of a horizontal mix of uses. And it's all put together by this big axial park here. So office is linked to it, retail is linked to it, and the residential is linked to this large open space. These are done by Thomas Prosek. He's one of the early renderers at the time that was doing this to help us imagine what it would look like with the sort of bay in the background and the extension of 95 and 181. And this is what it looks like today. The Whole Foods is at this corner. This is this corridor, Franklin Funds here. These are hard to see, so I'm just going to sort of roll through these. And then the residential on that other side. Crossings. It was originally the old Mill Mall. This is the layout of that thing. It was sort of an anchorless mall, if you'd want to call it that. There was no real big store within it at the time. It was bought by a group called the Plymouth Group. One of the pieces, most important thing that happened is the Caltrain station moved from Rengstorff to this site. So when we filled it in with the housing, this is where the new station was placed for the Caltrain station stop. The incredible disconnect between houses and jobs in Silicon Valley was a monster to tackle, and it probably still is a monster to tackle. The need for housing was incredible. At the same time, there was this idea that we still needed this smaller scale stuff. Once again, I think if we went back then, we would have much higher density product type in this. But at the time, we were stretching the limit by doing 3 stories here, 2.5 stories of townhouse here, and very small lot, single family on this edge.
In fact, we had to build up to that. The market was really only in place for the single-family homes. That was all that the developer really felt comfortable with initially. So there was a phase 1, which is the yellow single-family homes and some of the townhouses. And then as the economy improved, then we were able to move into the higher density.
Nobody would touch, the banks wouldn't touch this project.
Yep.
Wouldn't touch it. They said, it's not going to work. There's no way you're going to infill in this site. The gentleman who bought the land financed 4 houses, 1, 2, 3, and 4. He self-built them, paid for them by himself. He built this park right here and these 4 houses. One of the original photos is just of these 4 houses, not even these. He self-built them by himself with the park. He basically drove away after this was all said and done in a Maserati with a cigar and waving us all goodbye and flipping off the banks. It was a huge success. Every time somebody came to see a single-family house, he told me they sold a townhouse. Every time somebody came to see the zipper lot, they sold one of these. Every time somebody came to see an apartment, they sold one of these. So it was this strange mix of, I'm looking for something, I got something else.
Well, and in spite of the reluctance, to do this, this had the highest absorption rate of any residential project on the peninsula when it was built. So there was a reluctance from the market to build it, but then there was enormous market acceptance once it was built.
Yeah, the banks would have loved to get a hold of this now.
They just thought it wouldn't work.
They didn't think it would work. Small lot, single family, are you crazy? These were 30 foot wide and 60 feet deep, this product type. It's about almost 15, 20 dwelling units per acre for this. These are about 30 units per acre. This is called the zipper townhouse, where it's a sort of a staggered property line. So they didn't want to touch the density. They didn't want to touch the concept. They didn't want to touch the idea of the process. It's an old mall. You're never going to be able to do this. They actually ground up the parking lot. They built the caps for the parks, different drainage areas. It was very skinny roads. They didn't want to see any of that. It was a very unusual first step, I think, to start to see one of these sort of new developments. This was early 90s.
Mid-90s,
Yeah, 93, 94. This was our last piece of architecture in the office, too. We started out as an architecture planning firm. We didn't do another piece of architecture after this because it just was like that. You guys are probably maybe all architects, but it was a very difficult business strategy for us. We turned into more of a planning firm at this point, right after doing these working drawings. A 3D model, a real 3D model. These were all cast like plastic somehow. These are the first 4 homes that he built. So he built this model of this place. The final one in the Bay Area, as I sort of moved from north to south, was Jackson Taylor. Every one of these projects that I showed you, you don't actually have to get in a car to get to. It's either connected by SMART, BART, Caltrain, VTA, or there's a 5th system in there. I can't remember which one it is. So every single one is actually on a station, linked by a station. You never have to you can visit all of them and only transfer from transit systems to do it. Never even get in the car between. Jackson Taylor was an early transition of an industrial uses to residential. This idea that it's a combination of existing buildings and new open sites. So the reuse, some of them are actually an old existing industrial water tank with the new housing, some of the new housing with the existing neighborhood. So a real sort of comprehensive overall plan and a mix of reuse and new development interspersed to create a new place.
If anybody's been to the Gordon
project manager,
if anybody's been to the I think this is Rick's project. If anybody's been to the Gordon Biersch brewery, that was one of the first things that happened within this area, and it's pretty well built out now.
It had a similar idea too, that you had to buffer where transition to the neighborhood. The idea that the higher density in housing needed a secondary edge to make sure that it dealt with how it sat in the residential neighborhood. I think one of the big concepts.
Right, and the guidance that accompanied that, had radical notions like the front door of the unit should actually face the street, right? And that the parking should actually be behind the buildings, mid-block, or below the buildings if you can afford it with the higher density product.
So that was it. I brought a couple of these old plans. I was moving around that, which is one of the sort of funny original. We can all look back and laugh at the original paste ups of our guidelines. The other thing that I brought that I thought might be of interest was one of the original plans of Portland, where we actually cut and pasted. It's made a sticky back, USGS maps, laminated. It's not supposed to be a retrospective here. It's supposed to look back at sort of the old tools that we used to look at growth for these. So we mail ordered USGS maps. We pasted them together. We used Metroset lines and sticky backs and Mat9.
Right.
The local sat around and sort of pieced these things together rather than sitting in front of our computers.
Well, the hands-on sort of artisanal approach, I think, us old-timers, we appreciate it. But I think one of the main takeaways from this is just how long we've been at it, and the kinds of strides that have been made. And I think, Joe, I wonder whether you could summarize some of the things that you think have been the biggest strides as far as the accomplishments of the Congress of New Urbanism and Calthorpe Associates in particular. But then also I wonder whether you could comment on challenges that remain or things that have been just where we haven't gotten there yet.
I mean, probably everybody sees this, but I see my life in sort of 5-year frames, right? The first, and sort of reinventing myself every 5 years. Maybe everybody does this, or maybe it's used. The first 5 years, I think, were really this battle against suburban sprawl, right? We started seeing these houses, built at the edges of our sites, and we started to see this purple stuff, which is considered the new growth around our cities. And it was really bad, right? And so the first 5 years was really, maybe we only reorganized that growth. I don't know if we actually said, in the first 5 years that it should go back into the city, and it did go back into the city. I think the first 5 years we sort of reorganized that growth. We made it a little bit denser, we made it a little bit better.
Can I just interrupt?
This is the movement.
Can I interrupt you as you go? Because I think it would be interesting. So during that period, some of the simplest things that we were trying to do, I can think of 3 right off the top of my head. One was connected streets. The idea that there should be connectivity was an area that really had not been explored, and Farron Piers, actually Jack Piers, the founder of Farron Piers, back in the 90s did some seminal research that showed that interconnected streets had a lot of benefits to them. Up to that point, still today, but at least there's a lot of precedence now showing interconnected streets. Up to that point, there was, mainly just cul-de-sacs and arterials, really. Second thing was to bring the mix of uses, trying to make it so that there's an easy, walkable path between where you lived and where you might shop. And then the third thing was just trying to up the intensity a little bit. We thought it was a huge accomplishment just to convince communities to build, instead of at 8,000 square feet per lot, to 6,000 square feet per lot. That was a big deal. So sorry I interrupted.
Our big battles were getting rid of the cul-de-sac, getting skinnier streets, adding any kind of retail at all, getting any kind of office next to residential. And these
small
things
parks
sound little now.
And
little parks.
Right. Getting that's right, the Parks Department to allow 1 or 3 acre parks, something less than 10 acres. That was a big deal.
So, that's the sort of the first 5 years, I think, of this movement. Look at it as sort of a big movement. I think the next sort of 5 years was this idea of transit and sort of overall growth of a city. Sort of this idea that you can look at urban growth boundaries, you can look at transit as a system for your growth pattern. Portland, Denver, Salt Lake City. They wanted to, instead of, like I said before, just put out brush fires of growth, they wanted sort of an overall regional plan. So this idea of regionalism really took over, I think, in the next 5 years. By then, sort of the next 5, there was this idea of infill.
So the second 5 years is recognizing that a walkable neighborhood actually was the recipe for sustainable regions if you could use the transit to connect the TODs.
Right, if there was a different set of bones. So the organization of cities were around highways and around just quick growth. And I think the battles then were getting yelled at about, I'm not taking the train. Why am I paying $1 billion to put a train down? Well, why are you paying $1 billion for a bridge that you're not driving on? So there were these battles about why to pay for this infrastructure, or why is this important for my city to do this? And these battles were happening in Denver, Salt Lake, Austin, Texas, and they were starting to understand, I think, at the time that it was about a comprehensive growth pattern, trying to stop the original sprawl at the edges. Next was kind of the infill movement. By the time that was happening, so I started in '86, so we're in the '90s, early '90s maybe now, really looking at the reuse of malls like Old Mill, looking at the reuse of stuff around the stations like West Oakland, where it was. And there was a lot of master planning associated with this sort of second generation of land uses. Became much more valuable. At the time, I think what was happening was, the land was a little bit like, well, we can just keep spreading out and moving out. And all of a sudden there was some idea that, we need to look internally for our growth.
And the Hope 6 projects had a good synergy with that.
The Hope 6 was all urban, heavy urban infill. Chicago, Denver, again, we did Kurtz Park, we did Mandela Village in Oakland, we did a couple others. What was next? Are we into the present yet?
You can take us to the present.
International. We're doing a lot of international now. So it was maybe a domestic issue. It became somewhat more global, I think. The idea is we worked in India, we worked in China, where there's population issues and just sort of mass growth problems. And when we started to work internationally, we said, if we're going to keep trying to change the world, we got to go to India, we got to go to China, we got to go to places that aren't just 400,000, however big the United States is. I mean, we're only a small fraction of changing the world. So
And it's in the regional planning, I think, also is in there.
I think after that, the whole aspect of integrating transportation and land use from a regional perspective, where you'll be looking at both from an investment purpose.
Yeah, we're doing a real recent 5 years has been this idea of analytics. We've created a piece of software in the office that actually looks at consumption, looks at and analyzes consumption of water, consumption of gas, consumption of land. So this idea that we can analytically analyze two scenarios, a bad scenario, if you call it that, versus a better growth scenario. So that's been occupying us over the last 5 years also.
So you've been having a series of battles which have mostly been continuing to build on your principles as they go along, but now that you have some stuff that's been in place for a while, have you rethought or nuanced any of those beginning ideas?
Yeah, I think it's always changed a lot. I think that the thing that I always regret back is just how much it could have been. Like, I always believe that more density could have been better in almost every single one that I've done, and the struggle is just kind of getting there. But I think everybody that walks through a lot of these places say this could have been more or bigger or better. There could have been more mix of uses. There could have been higher densities. There could have been we could have zoned this higher than it actually was. I mean, almost every one to the T that I walk through is sort of what I hope to do. What else? What you mean, sort of a lesson learned? Like, what are the lessons learned?
I think the battles for the skinny street continue. You know, in a funny way, the multimodal street concept, the idea of walkable streets, it's been sort of absorbed by the transportation professionals who still subscribe to wider travel lanes than are really necessary. And so what you get are streets that are shared streets. They have the bike lanes and they have the sidewalks and so forth, but the traffic speeds, the vehicle speeds that are along them are still inappropriate for making a really livable place. So I walk away from a lot of projects really lamenting the amount of asphalt that remains. Yeah.
One of the other things is just transit ridership. We walked around Stapleton the other day and we pulled out some number like, we have 50,000 people riding this train every day, and the person next to us was from Calgary or something. We have 400,000 a day doing it. Your number's way off in comparison. China is an incredible amount of transit ridership and bike ridership. And one of the things I think is, I'm surprised we're still so far behind on ridership numbers. Even in a huge success like Denver, ridership is way up. It's still really minor numbers.
Other questions? Well, I want to thank Joe for making time available to.
I had a,
You only got another question?
yeah, I have.
Sure, Brock.
Since Catholic has done a lot of work abroad, and especially bringing the idea of DOD abroad, I mean, it is an inherently American idea. I mean, other communities in Western Europe didn't really have this issue of low density per se. So when you brought it abroad, I mean, obviously China and India have much higher densities. How would you be able to redo the same ideas in those contexts? I mean, I'm assuming you had to convince at least one person to agree to something like that.
So when we started working internationally, it was a bit of an odd epiphany that we had, because it did have density, it did have transit ridership, it did have a bike people using. So we sort of said, well, if all these matrices are already in place, then what are we actually doing here? And so in some ways we flipped and we went after different things. We went after block sizes, actually. We went after these mega 100-hectare scale block patterns. We went after what we would call the sort of buildings in a row, the sort of non-urbanistic pattern of the architecture itself, and sort of this Soviet block pattern. We went after sprawl. Well, yeah, what was happening there was new cities were growing up in China. So we were saying, well, how do we relink it back to the old city? How do we relink it to the old place? How do we preserve the old pattern of these old villages too? So in some ways, you're right. They already had a lot of what we were trying to implement in place, and we really started going after a totally different set of design criteria. We have you seen that book that the Energy Foundation published? It's the 8 principles. in China. That's a pretty good one to where we were with the sort of new set of principles that we created internationally versus domestically.
And it's interesting, as you mentioned, that China, that these principles are still relevant. It's just focusing on sort of a different set of issues. The human scale is, I think, especially relevant as you described it.
That's, to me, that's also pretty evident that of the four, they're not equal. Abroad, I think, especially in India and China, the human scale is probably the most important because you have all the other stuff, maybe not the conservation. So maybe the bottom two are probably more important than the above two because you pretty much have a lot of that in place. It's just that they don't design for the human scale. And sometimes I worry when I see a lot of DOD written everywhere, is that they're just completely missing the point. Because they're talking about transit and building everything there, but nobody's talking about the actual design guidelines of how to build. And it's good that, I mean, if those aspects are sort of hammered in about small blocks and human scale, I think that would be much more effective.
Diversity and balance was another one. They were really separating their uses. They had these huge housing blocks in one area and then all the jobs were somewhere else. So there was this huge problem of transitioning between residential jobs.
So emulating the kind of the Western model where NRIs, non-resident Indians, you would come back to give them the same place that we're used to seeing here. It was that same model. Hey, we're giving you the same half-acre lot that you had enjoyed there. You're getting the same thing here, secluded in the mountains, all of that.
It's the American dream.
The American dream.
Come on.
Close
Now we're
knit
trying to program
community.
people to not want that.
Yeah.
We've been eating at the buffet for 50 years, and now you can't come and eat.
I would say early on, the international work was, okay, build Southern California here. I don't know if that's the case anymore. I mean, that used to be kind of the original task that I think people came to us for, like, oh, just build me these single-family houses, but I want them in China, and I want them to look like a mission style, and I want them to look like a California bungalow, and I want them to look like, that's sort of a different, that was, I think, maybe 10 years ago that was happening. I don't know if that's really the
It's
case.
still happening down the road for me.
I just,
Quite literally.
last year I peer-reviewed the DOD guidelines for India.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that aspect of human scale wasn't quite enhanced. It was just saying the same thing that you have to build around transit, you have to have high density. But nobody was really speaking to human scale or infill for that matter around the stations that are within cities in a way that makes sense. And that's one of those concerns that I have.
It was definitely a different set of patterns because I do believe some of the stuff that we were trying to do was already there. It was just how do you reconfigure it? The ridership was up, the density was up. But give me your card and I'll send you this last book that we wrote. It was called Building Cities for Livability, and it was for the China through the Energy
I'll
Foundation.
email you.
Arthur?
Yeah, as you're planning now getting into air quality and energy and such, for example, I went to a presentation recently at Cal, a guy doing solar fields in Israel and in this country, 3-4 places. And I'm just wondering if the general planning field is starting to get into these directions.
Yeah, we have a whole division now in the office that just looks at analytics and the analytics of the environment, water consumption, gas consumption.
Are you doing that in
Absolutely.
terms of carrying capacity, or what's the question you're asking or answering with those?
It's a comparison of what it does is it analyzes two sets of growth. It takes a, let's just say, bad pattern versus a good pattern, and it compares how much consumption the bad pattern has over the new pattern. And it's mostly environmental. It's mostly, consumption of gas versus renewables. It's a consumption of water versus not. It's consumption of land versus not. So it's essentially a matrix that is 100% environmentally associated, and it tries to measure those and make a better pattern. Right.
I mean, for example, you're building solar field with these huge fields of solar panels to fuel the city and such.
Yeah, but in sort of much more general terms. I mean, we're designating areas that could be for solar fields. We're designating, but only in a sort of a bubble diagram, 3,000 feet in the air level, much higher level, say, than really drilling down, say, a specific.
I think the work is really trying to stay focused on land use and transportation integration and urban design factors. And so to do this comparison, you know, the business as usual, which is sort of the bad, versus sort of an aggressive transit-oriented development model, and maybe something in between. In order to do that comparison, the modelers tend to want to keep apples to apples. So if you're trying to make a persuasive case about land use and transit and urban design, you sort of like mainly focus on that, and you don't worry so much about the solar arrays, because those could happen maybe under any scenario. And the metrics are really compelling, really convincing, and it's really become there's a whole new. It's not even part of the main business now. It's called Calthorpe. What?
There are two offices.
What's it called?
Calthorpe Analytics.
Analytics is doing this sort of metric. But early on, you know, when it came to trying to persuade whole regions or people in the regions to adopt a more transit-friendly approach, even early on we relied on trying to break it down so people could really understand it in real terms. If you decide that you're going to be auto-oriented, these are how many freeway miles you can expect to build, and this is what you're going to pay. And this is how much transit you'd have to build if you did the transit model, and this is what you'd have to pay, which turns out to be actually less the cost of the infrastructure if you're more compact. And transit-friendly is actually less than.
The genesis of Calthorpe Analytics was what I would call the place types. Remember, we were working on the place types? And what we were doing was we were charging areas with different uses. Okay? So we would say a neighborhood center. We were able to broadly paintbrush a place type, a neighborhood center on an area. Now we've taken a GIS program and we've charged the pixels. So if we put a pixel down on a map, it's charged with some civic uses, some streets. We're able to load up the pixel with different uses on it. So the transformation, when we were working on it, was more of an analytical thing. We've actually transitioned it to a measurable pixel on a map.
Is that Vision California?
Yes, of course.
Or
The first job that we were paid to do this was Vision California, and that was looking at the corridor, transit corridors in California. That was about 4 years ago. Now it's into a broader scope. It's an internal project, and we've created two different programs. We've done one that's called Rapid Fire, and that's just really a fancy Excel spreadsheet. The other one is called Urban Footprint. Urban Footprint is a GIS charged pixel that we can start to paintbrush full areas with these pixels and charging. But that's correct. It was started through Vision California.
Well, thanks everybody for coming, and Joe, thank you especially.
You're welcome.